Yeah? Okay. Right. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Avni Rambhia. I'm an industry principal with Frost & Sullivan. We provide market research as well as strategy for video and for secure content. Before we get started, two quick caveats. For those who know me, when I get excited, I talk very, very fast. So if I'm rattling off, please wave me down and tell me to slow down. The other thing is this is very much intended to be an interactive session. It's not meant to be death by PowerPoint. So please, at any point of time, if you disagree with what I'm saying, if something's not clear, if there's a gap, just raise your hands, flag me down, we'll take this where it needs to go. With those caveats, this is what we cover in the digital media team at Frost & Sullivan. It's a fairly end-to-end practice from the camera to all the NLE systems, compression, management, metadata, security, delivery, monitoring, analytics. The reason I bring that up is when we provide perspectives, and be it any market, whether it's HEVC or OVPs or DRM, we do it from a fairly holistic perspective. So with DRM, for example, we're not just looking at what CE devices or browsers support, but also what the server side is doing, also what the silicon is doing, also what the analytics firms are doing, and so forth. So when we provide predictions, we've managed to be pretty accurate and sticky about them, and a lot of it, I think, is due to this end-to-end perspective that we have. At Frost & Sullivan, I cover encoding, transcoding markets and all security markets, so DRM and HEVC are the two topics that I tend to talk about most often. With that, we're going to do a quick set of DRM 102 slides. DRM 101 was the previous talk. I have a link in here if anyone wants to go back. Really just to level set the discussion and the ecosystem, move it forward from there. The bulk of the intended discussion today is the debate between browsers and apps. We've been getting a lot of questions about, what's right for my business, what's right today, what's right tomorrow, what does it mean in the context of DRM, multi-DRM, native DRM, downloadable DRM. So that's most of the focus today. We will talk about the implications of the time axis. And what I mean by that is a lot of the customers that we see making decisions are making them at the current point of time, t equal to 0. A lot of the vendors who are building solutions are necessarily looking 12 months out, 24 months out, 36 months out. Security being a program, not a project, that's a fundamental paradigm. Stuff will get broken. How do you patch it and move it? So I will spend some time there, and then we'll get into some conclusions in terms of do's and don'ts. This isn't a DRM tech talk, so there's no cryptography, no algorithms, no implementation details, no robustness rules, nothing of the sort. I'm happy to direct you to people who know much more about that than I do, if that's the sort of information you're looking for. So just a quick set of definitions. I know DRM is most often equated with anti-piracy or piracy prevention or encryption or decryption. Certainly, those are all aspects of DRM. But the most important transaction that you have with DRM is bringing a service to a legitimate user in a way that is fairly monetized. When everything goes well, that is the purpose of DRM. It's kind of like brakes on cars. They're not on cars to make them go slower. They're on there to help them to speed up. DRM is very much the same way. Built correctly, it gives you the secure framework to help you really grow your business, make it diverse, make it personalized, make it widely accessible. In that journey, your DRM vendor serves as your trusted business partner. In many services, they're almost as critical as your bandwidth provider or your CDN provider. When DRM works well, it is invisible. When DRM breaks, it can cause a lot of grief. And again, this is a time-based thing, so it has to work well at t equal to 0. It also has to work well every moment of the step moving forward. Piracy doesn't necessarily mean that someone cracked your content and put it on the open internet for everyone to stream. It could simply be password sharing. It could be taking your content and redistributing it in a region where it was not supposed to be allowed, or making it available 2 seconds before it was supposed to be streamed. As our consumption of OTT content becomes more and more complex, the nuances of piracy correspondingly become more and more complex. And what that does for the DRM system is it expands the definitions and it expands the feature scope of what you need from DRM. So where once upon a time, where once upon a time, it was enough for us to have a certain version of DRM that was sending 99% of content to one operating system and one browser. Now you have multiple tiers of services in multiple regions across multiple devices, all of which have time-sensitive requirements. There are output control situations, and so as businesses change and as content experiences become richer, these demands on DRM and the corresponding definitions of piracy start to become more and more involved. What that does to the DRM system itself is you now go from being essentially a PKI exchange system with a text document attached to it, your private key, your public key, your content decryption key, and your license, to a much more multifaceted system. You're talking about interfacing to billing and tracking systems. You're talking about watermarking, forensics, and trader tracing. You're talking about output protection, link control, and most importantly, you're talking about revocation and renewability. So when something breaks, and it will break, what is the process of recovering? That's part of the DRM system as well. When we look at the client-side devices and the client-side browsers that we are tasked with sending content to, it's not necessarily just this DRM and no other. There's a spectrum on which you have available DRM systems that live. For those of us who follow agile workloads, the minimum viable product for DRM is a crypto core. That's what it used to be, the key exchanges, the authentication, and the license exchange. In today's world, that's really not even halfway there. So you almost always have to go beyond what's most likely to be built into, let's say, a phone or a tablet, which is the crypto core, and implement additional layers on top of it, which is what we've been calling the complete DRM client. So this is what actually understands the license, or what we call the entitlement, interprets the entitlement, checks things like routing, jailbreaking, timestamps, geolocations, enforces all those requirements, and gives you a reasonably holistic, secure playback experience. Now, if you're a premium VOD service or a premium subscription service, even that's not necessarily going to be enough. So you're going to need better authentication, deeper integrity verification. You're going to have to fail intelligently also. We'll get to this in the next slide, but a lot of your devices that are out there are not current generation new devices. Smart TVs stay in use for 5 to 7 years, tablets stay in use for 3 to 4 years. What you have as state of the art today is not going to be ubiquitously available to you when you go and send a service out into the world. So you're going to have intelligent failure components as well, which say, okay, if my intention was to send a 1080p stream to this device, but it only has a certain version of DRM, do I deny service, or do I send a 720p resolution, or do I monetize it in some other way, or do I put some other restrictions on it? All of those start to become considerations as you move towards what we call a full secure player. Now, not every single service has to be on that right side spectrum. If you're a basic streaming service, or if you're a low ARPU market streaming service, if you've got a specific set of content that you own and is well controlled, the left side may work perfectly well for you. If you're a premium service with high-end early release window content that you may want to make available for offline consumption, for example, you're going to have to be further to the right. And this is the notion, if there's one thing that you take away from this talk today, I want it to be that there is a spectrum, and you have to find where on the spectrum you fit for your business. It's also important to call out that with DRM, and unlike CAS, which we'll get to in a second, you're not really fixed into a certain decision. So when we deploy conditional access systems, you've got millions of set-top boxes that go out, you've got fixed chipsets, you've got custom-built middleware, you have a fixed head end. That's really not the case with DRM. You can change protection strategies, you can shift how your apps are architected, you can change your protocols. A lot of that depends on how your server-side system is architected, and again, we'll get back to that in a second. But the crux of the matter is there is a spectrum. You're not bound to the left. You don't always have to go to the right. You will have to find for your specific service and your specific goals where on this continuum you need to be. Once you've decided that, the choice of DRM systems and the choice of app versus browser becomes much, much easier. Any questions so far? All right, so I'm assuming at this point I'm preaching to the choir, but I did want to make this point. We are no longer in a single DRM ecosystem. Multi-DRM is absolutely inevitable, and the reason is that we are catering to a highly fragmented user ecosystem. I don't know if that font is too small to read, but essentially about a fourth of the devices that you will be serving are either directly using iOS or are using formats closely correlated to Apple's format. Android accounts for the vast majority of the remaining devices. However, not all of them are the highest level of Widevine, and not all of them are the latest version of Android. You also have the relatively higher end devices like the gaming consoles, the streaming media devices, the smart TVs that tend to offer much, much more sophisticated inbuilt DRM support that correlates with the type of content experiences and the type of content services that they are typically expected to receive. Phones and tablets will typically have a relatively lower level of API support, a relatively lower choice of DRM systems. You're more likely to be using checkbox DRM in a browser with smaller resolution content, relatively lower viewing times, or relatively lower viewing engagement on those types of devices. So it is a fragmented ecosystem. In order to serve that ecosystem, you're going to have multiple DRMs that you will leverage on a case-by-case basis. One aspect that's not always evident to the folks that we speak with, and I want to call out here, is the breakout of new devices sold in a given year is easy to understand and visualize. The breakout of your deployed devices ecosystem is somewhat more complicated. So as we talked about, devices have a useful lifetime. And so if you look at the breakout of DRM system units deployed, and keep in mind that a given device can have one or more DRMs on it, you can see that, and this is a logarithmic scale in millions of units, so they're not quite as close to each other as they seem. I just needed the niche devices to bubble up a little bit more. Between Widevine, Apple, and PlayReady, you do have fairly broad device coverage. But what I want to emphasize is not all Widevine clients are identical, not all PlayReady clients are identical, because those that were shipped in earlier years will have a lower security level or a lower version to them. Those that are shipped on more current hardware will have better trusted execution environment, better silicon, better TAM support. So even though it looks like you've got a relatively homogeneous system with the DRMs, keep in mind that those individual bars themselves are fragmented. And that's again where multi-DRM comes into play, because this is your abstraction layer. You've got a company or a service that's competent in knowing what these different formats are, what these different levels are, what their implications are on your licensing obligations, and they can abstract all of that out from your business, which is essentially getting a really delightful content service to as many users as humanly possible. So that's your multi-DRM. Again, the clients themselves are not multi-DRM. Each client typically will have one or at most two DRMs that you will leverage on it. The multi-DRM aspect comes in at the server, where you start to abstract your overlying service from your underlying complexity. Any questions here? All right, so HTML5 and its implications, a lot of this conversation really started gaining momentum when we had Flash and smooth streaming reach end of life, and when Dash and essentially HLS became the de facto standards for content streaming moving forward. This hit you more immediately if you were delivering content to browsers. If you were delivering content through apps, you have a little bit more leeway in which protocols you can leverage and when you transition from one protocol to another. But if you're relying on browsers, which can be installed at will by your consumers, you kind of have to stick to their timeline. So we have seen a lot of folks, going in and scrambling, trying to figure out, how to get the most out of the infrastructure they already have, out of the workflows they already understand, out of content that is already encrypted and formatted and packaged, versus what we know the world is going to be moving forward. One additional wrench in this is the encrypted media extensions were originally designed to ease the interoperability between encrypting content once and serving it on any device. What ended up happening, for better or for worse, is that each browser sort of selected one DRM and bound its implementation to that. So not to go into excruciating level of detail, but the CDMI interface was originally intended for any DRM implementation to be accessible through any browser. It turns out in practice that's not quite easy to implement, and it's very expensive to maintain from a browser vendor perspective over time. So you essentially have, if you're on Apple and you're using Safari, you're going to get fair play. You're going to get fair play for a number of other reasons, but that's one of them. If you're using Chrome, you're almost always going to get Widevine. If you're using Edge, you're going to end up with PlayReady. With that fragmentation comes one other problem. You are delimited in terms of what type of service you can deliver to an end user in the context of what browser they're using on what device. Because you can't control how many DRMs are available through the browser, you are automatically bound to whatever common denominator that browser provides to you. And you have very little influence over the browser itself. The end user decides what browser they're going to be using. So that's kind of a problem if you take the other side of it, which is, set-top box use is falling. OTT is the new pay TV, and apps are your new middleware. Browsers by extension are your proxy for middleware. So if you're trying to do closely controlled, highly managed, very quality conscious experiences, and yet you have no control over the end rendering platform, over the security profile, over the screen usage, over the network, how do you make those two things meet? And that's a multi-pronged solution, but multi-DRM is the beginning of that. Apps is sort of the end of that argument, which we'll get to in a second. Multi-DRM is one way to bridge the madness that exists in these individual user fragmentations. So on the one hand, it's less painful than it was before in that you don't have completely separate silos. But on the other hand, the devil is very much in the details, and there is still plenty of room for stuff to break. So for those of us who are absolute encryption geeks, you know that there's partial encryption in some protocols, there's complete encryption in other protocols. So even though theoretically it's the same packet format and the same encryption algorithm, you're not going to have interoperable encrypted bit streams. The other problem is that not everyone's using Dash. So you've got a mixture of Dash and HLS, and you've got a continued pool of folks who are using smooth streaming through plugins or through other bypass options. The entitlement languages also differ from system to system. So, if you're a streaming service that's trying to provide a certain type of experience and a certain level of privilege across tablets, phones, smart TVs, and gaming consoles made by about 45 different vendors around the world, you will have probably 6 to 7 variants of DRM at a minimum. And each one of these will speak and understand different rights languages. So if you're not going to have irate users calling you and saying, hey, I can get this on my iPad, but I can't get it on my console, you're going to have to do a lot of rationalization of the entitlements, and that tends to happen on the server side. So correctly translating your intended user experience and your intended content privileges across all these different systems in all their different variants is what a multi-DRM system can take care of for you. For simplistic services, again, if it's just access or just access with certain kind of output protection, this isn't hard and you can do it on your own. But the more sophisticated you get, again, keeping that continuum in mind, the farther to the right that your service needs to be, the more you're going to have to rely on full-fledged multi-DRM systems to make those features come together, make them stick, and more importantly, make them maintainable over time. Any questions so far? Yeah.
Doesn't that require like a huge capital investment when you have to think about all the different DRMs for different roles?
It's a good question. If you build it all yourself, yes, it'll be not just capital but also time. And there's a very good chance that by the time you're done building it, something else will have changed. So we do have, I can give this to you later, we have a bunch of analysis on when do you build and when do you buy. And that's correlated to how much expertise and budget you have in-house. It's correlated to how many devices you're trying to reach in what time frame, and how agile you expect to need to be in order to stay competitive. But if you're on the right side of the spectrum in a very intensely competitive space, you probably want to partner or buy. You don't want to try to build this yourself. But done right, it doesn't have to be expensive. It's not cheap, but it doesn't have to be expensive.
And how does that stack up against encrypted HLS instead of using full-blown DRM?
So sometimes you can use encrypted HLS, and sometimes you just can't, right? So if you're doing, let's say you're a broadcaster who's sending OTT streams over the internet, encrypted HLS will serve you to a certain point. But if you were trying to, let's say, do trader tracing on where a leaked stream is coming from and then shut off offending streams, you're going to need a layer of watermarking on top of that, and you're going to have a piracy monitoring service sitting behind it. Encrypted HLS on its own is not going to serve that purpose. If you want to do offline content access, if you want to check geolocations before you send a certain piece of content, if you want to have differential streams, so for certain devices you send HD, for others you send 4K, none of that's really possible with encrypted HLS. So it's a good place to start. Again, from a minimum viable product perspective, it's a perfectly fair place to start. But you very quickly run out of legs with that simplistic approach.
And that doesn't stop downloading. So once you're able to decode it, the bad user can just download it.
They can. I mean, stream capture engines are always there. And the higher the resolution, the easier it is to get to analog recapture. So yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? Yeah.
Quick question. I'm not sure whether you've already answered. So Apple now, so iOS now supports the fragment MP4.
Yeah.
Do you think that actually paved the way that we can encrypt once and then service to different platforms, let the shaking happen in different places?
Yeah, I think that's the eventual goal. So, and I know there are folks in this room who know this way better than I do, but I think Widevine has now extended support to the fragmented, not just the fragmented MP4, but also the partial encryption format that Apple uses. So that's one level of interoperability. There are other DRM systems that aren't there yet, but I know that they're very aggressively looking at it. Part of the problem with that is, Apple's in a fairly privileged position. And because they have a closely controlled, vertically integrated system, they're able to make certain trade-offs of performance versus security that other systems don't have the luxury of making. So I don't know if we will ever get to a point where you have complete uniformity. Again, I defer to those in this audience, and you know who you are, who know more about this than I do. But in general, I would say you're going to have at least some level of fragmentation. So definitely between Dash and HLS, definitely between partial and full encryption. And to some extent, once you start to get to things like virtual reality, probably a whole other can of worms. So yeah, no one size fits all anytime soon. Any other questions, comments? All right. So, excuse me. With that, let's dive into the the whole browser versus app argument, right? How many folks here are using both browsers and apps for delivery? Almost everyone, right? So you've lived this dilemma. I'm going to hurry through it then, and if you need me to slow down anywhere, let me know. Browsers have some immediate advantages. They're relatively simple to deploy. They are very favorable to discoverable services. So in other words, if you go to a search engine and you look for a certain piece of content, if the service is available via the same browser, it's very likely to get clicked into, and it's less likely to get clicked out of. The reach and the portability is much higher. It's HTML5. How can you go wrong? On the other hand, if you have an app, you have much more control over your roadmap. So simple things like when certain streaming formats are switched in and out, how your screen real estate is used, what mouse clicks, what user interactivity, what other native device-specific features you can rope in, how you do authentication, how you save passwords, how you do two-factor. how you fail safe, how you force updates. You have much, much more control over the end-to-end experience with an app. You have much less need to worry about all those individual nitty-gritties if you're choosing the browser route. The flexibility of DRM is very closely tied to the app approach. If you're using browsers, as we've seen before, pretty much you get the DRM as part of that ecosystem. Whereas if you're specific about wanting to choose a certain DRM system or wanting to integrate certain security features, right now you more or less have to go the app route. There is a middle ground here where you have an app that's using a browser framework underneath, and at that point you can choose whichever browser framework you want. That tends to be referred to as hosted web apps. I'm going to kind of allude to that middle ground as we go through these slides, but for simplicity, we're just looking at two extremes. So there are pros, there are cons, right? And essentially any pro on this column is a con on the other side. The operator, when you're sending content out to a browser, pretty much the only thing you have control over is whether to send or whether to not send. That's pretty much the end of it. You don't necessarily have insight into what's happening with the content. You don't have a lot of control over how to manipulate the content once it's being sent across. And that's fine for many services. Again, you're going to be on a spectrum. But if you need fine-grained control, if you need fine-grained visibility, then browsers are not going to help. The updates are also outside the control of the operator, and I want you to hold that thought for a second because we're going to dive into it quite a bit in just a few slides. The apps definitely have higher complexity up front. I will say that it's getting easier with more and more DRM vendors understanding that they need to provide secure cross-platform playback. With a lot of new startups starting to understand that they have to do secure cross-platform playback. You're starting to see a convergence with the security expertise and the multi-platform playback expertise. We're seeing costs come down very, very quickly. So where we were saying the porting costs are $250,000 per device as recently as last year, we're seeing them start to come down to closer to $150 per device, and they're continuing to fall. The implementation times are also continuing to fall, so you're going from a couple of months to a couple of weeks. We have some frameworks that are promising a couple of days, and that's without sacrificing any of the flexibility and the control. So it's getting better on the app side, but it's definitely simpler on the browser side. And you do have to make more effort to attract and retain viewers, right? So to have someone go to your app, especially if it's one of 3,000 channels on Roku or whatever number they're up to now, to get them to download an app to your smart TV takes a lot of marketing effort. And to keep them coming back to your app takes a lot of engagement effort. You have to be willing to make those investments, very similar to what any pay TV service provider would make. But you don't have the luxury of having a set-top box sitting in the house once you've acquired the customer. Apps are very easy to click in and out of. So when you're going the app route, bear in mind that this is a marketing commitment as much as it is a technological commitment. Any questions on apps versus browsers? All right, so that decision is rooted at t equal to 0, right? This, and I apologize, this is a text-heavy slide, but I kind of ran out of ideas on how to make it visually pretty. So there are two, there are two circumstances under which you will update your DRM core and your playback infrastructure. If you're fortunate, it will be a planned update. If you live in the real world like most of us, at least half the time it will be an entirely unplanned update. So forced updates happen when you have, typically when you have a zero-day exploit, right? So someone, releases a script that will get the private key out and give you one quick app that can put everything on the internet. You have something like that, you're getting into a forced update situation. If somebody's private keys were suddenly published on the internet so that, you can create clones of what looks like a Samsung Smart TV, and I'm not pointing names at anyone, or you have something that looks like a clone of the Apple iOS, and you can, anyone can receive content, that you've got a forced update in the making. Planned updates are generally easier to deal with. This is when you're proactively improving. You know that watermarking is coming down the line. You know that hardware protection path is coming down the line. You know that AES 256 is failing. You know that 4K content is coming. You know that you want to do early window VOD. You have some time to get ahead of all those changes. So whether you're doing a planned update or a forced update, the process is essentially the same. You have to develop an update to the crypto core, so change your authentication, change your encryption algorithms, revise your revocation whitelists, all that fun stuff. You then have to integrate that update into the platforms. And that's where you have the big difference between browser-based and app-based. And more specifically, you have a difference between the native default DRMs that are built into the systems and a chosen or a downloadable DRM or a freely selected DRM that may be downloaded, that may be built in, but that you have much more control over. If this is I hesitate to use the word native because native has positive connotations when it comes to app implementations. It doesn't always have positive connotations when it comes to choice of DRM system. But whatever DRM system is built into your device, the device vendor or the device OS vendor or the app playback store or the browser store, someone has to take the DRM update, integrate it into the stack, push the stack out, and make sure that everybody updates their stack. That's hard. It's expensive, it's disruptive, and it's profitable to absolutely nobody, right? So if you're building, a device and you have two choices, you make it cooler so people want it, or you make it more easily updatable, guess which feature gets cut all the time, every time. That's where apps, you have much more leverage because even if it's a third-party DRM vendor, they are contractually obligated to you, or you can switch DRMs. It's relatively easy to put out an update of an app that completely changes the DRM guts underneath, especially when it's downloadable in the TAM. So if you need control, if you need speed, if you need flexibility, the apps work not just better at t equal to 0, but at t equal to whatever moving forward. Browsers, on the other hand, are replaceable. So it's not like, again, in contrast to conditional access, this isn't make this choice once and live with it forever. You can always switch from one to the other, turn it off in the browser, move it to the app, that's fine. My point really is at some point of time, you're going to have to move towards downloadable DRMs in an app, unless the browser ecosystem changes dramatically in the short term. So I will more or less skip through this. I do want to leave time for Q&A at the end. But the takeaway here is that if you're a basic service, browser only works fine. The simple fails, the simple checkboxes, all of that is fine. If you're a premium service, you're going to need more features than just the crypto core. You are going to be highly sensitive to hacks, and a default DRM is very unlikely to meet your needs across all devices for all eternity. The more sophisticated your service, obviously, the more important it is that you choose your DRM consciously on every single device. Not to forget, and I know that we love, at least I love to be buried in the end devices and worry about piracy from the end devices. Hackers are kind of free that way. They're going to attack the weakest link. And if the weakest link is in your VOD server, which has the default Windows password because you never changed it, and that's where all your pristine mezzanine files are sitting, they're not going to bother to hack the trusted execution environment. They're going to go tap into the content on the VOD server. So keep this end-to-end ecosystem in mind. If you're the person who is in charge of securing your content and your service, don't spend all your time on the device. Make sure you're looking at the server side, the workflows, the IPs, the outsourcing, all of that. Couple of stories to share here. So did anyone follow the Larson Studios exploit? You may have heard it as 32 TV shows stolen from Netflix last month. This is one studio that does a lot of post-processing, specifically around audio, I think. And someone got into their systems and pulled all these TV shows in pristine, uncompressed format off of their VOD servers. The content service providers themselves had fully vetted IT systems. The outsourcing, resources did not. So you're going to start to see, similar to what we saw in finance, similar to what we saw in healthcare, there is going to be a probe for the easiest way to get content. The other really nice thing about tapping directly into the server systems or the backend systems is all the content is there immediately, and you can keep tapping into it for as long as you're not discovered. So there are long-term covert tap-ins that we've seen. Sony in particular, I think, was infiltrated for a year almost before they even knew that their networks had been tapped into. So keep this in mind. I mean, protect the client for sure, but don't forget about the server. For those of you who are doing live OTT broadcasts, bear in mind that those networks are getting hijacked too. For those of you who follow the C-SPAN story, it was about 10 to 20 minutes of the live C-SPAN broadcast that was taken over by a different country's broadcast system. France's TV5 Monde actually saw a terrorist overtake their networks and send content. This is going to happen more and more. So IP is wonderful. It's agile, it's cheap, it's plentiful, it's widespread. It's also very easy to hack. And it's sort of a no man's land because you can't take traditional cybersecurity tools and apply them naively to broadcast workflows. Try telling a file encryption system that you have to deal with a 12 gig per second contribution feed. It doesn't work. It's not designed to work that way. So we do have Cisco, Kudelski, who's the owner of Nagra, Ericsson, I believe, Nokia, SES, and all the large consulting firms are coming in with products as well as services to get cybersecurity done to production grade in the context of broadcast. Look for those solutions, actively ask about them. At a minimum, make sure that your broadcast IT leads are as savvy about cybersecurity as your traditional IT leads. So with that, these are the quick do's and don'ts. Definitely embrace multi-DRM. There's no reason to feel that you're limited in your choice of one particular DRM on one particular ecosystem. Plan for fragmentation. Make your server robust and agile. Once your server is architected for multi-DRM, you can freely change what happens underneath that. That gives you the agility and flexibility you need to respond to whatever is happening. As you're planning your security, don't look at security or at copyright owner requirements as your design principles. Look at consistency, reach, and longevity. You will have multiple options to reach those three goals. Choose what works best for your particular service. Judge the level of control you need. Judge it fearlessly. Don't judge it in the context of a box you think you may be in, and then work to retain that level of control. There are plenty of options available, from servers to clients to playback to DRM systems to key management services, that can put you in the place that you need to be for the long term. And definitely pursue hybrid agile strategies. Using default streaming to Chrome works very well in many cases, even for the premium DRM systems. And it's really good to see a lot of folks raising their hands already on those hybrid strategies. Recognize that you can move freely from browser to apps back and forth, that this is a fail fast kind of ecosystem if you've done your server architecture right. And then the last thought I want to leave with is today's state of the art is not going to be tomorrow's state of the art. So what you have as a must-have today may be fine with today's state of the art, but it's not compatible with the old devices that are still in use. And when these devices become the old devices that are still in use 2 years from now, you're going to have a different set of problems to deal with. So understand that at some point of time, you're going to have a custom DRM solution. You may be lucky today, you certainly will not be lucky 2 years from now. Start to plan for that now. And finally, for the app versus browser decision, really do look at your specific service in the context of your target devices and make those choices accordingly. That's all I had. I'm happy to take questions, or if there's a free-form discussion we want to have, that's fine too.
Just going back to his question, is there an advantage over between crypto core and encrypted HLS or encrypted stream? Or do you have to upgrade to those two other levels that you talked about, complete and full, in order to actually get something out of DRM over just basic?
No, you do. So even with the crypto core, it's user-specific encryption. So with encrypted HLS, at least wherever I've seen it implemented, it's a generic session-based encryption. So you're not tying the content to a specific user device or a specific user identity. You're tying it to a specific authenticated session. And it's not as strong or as persistent as a full-fledged DRM. Also because you don't have correlation to the user identity, you have less flexibility in customizing a license for, let's say, someone you know is a premium customer versus is a basic customer. You also can't fail as intelligently. You can either send it or you can't send it. And so even the basic crypto core will give you a better sense of user-specific sessions than the generic encrypted HLS.
What if you mix tokenization with encrypted HLS to get you that entitlements piece?
You can. Again, at that point, you start to build something that you could just as easily or probably more cheaply license. So certainly it can be done. I mean, there's nothing in fact, you can build your own DRM system from scratch. It's not rocket science. It's just in the long term, if you wanted to scale or if you want to adapt it or change it, if you've built your own proprietary system, you're stuck with maintaining it. Whereas if you're using something that's commercial or widely available, that vendor should take care of it for you. But yeah, there's a million ways to do it, for sure. You don't have to go the DRM route.
And this custom DRM solution is like you're recommending us to finally just go to this, work on a custom DRM solution?
Having built my own DRM, having worked with Microsoft on the Windows Media DRM team, and having worked for a company that helped harden implementations, yes, my experience over the last 20 years says, don't do stuff that you're not good at doing. Least of all, I've had my own crypto algorithm get hacked too, and I'm supposed to be good at this stuff, so that. I would say yes. If security is not your core competency, I wouldn't bet your house on it.
Like for the apps, right? You're saying have that DRM component. And that's what you speak of in terms of custom DRM. Like if you have like an app, have that DRM under the hood.
No, that's fine. He was talking about building his own tokenization system, which at that point you're starting to build components of the DRM yourself. In that context, I would say you probably want to go with something that's commercial and ready-made. But you can perfectly have custom-built apps that are leveraging commercial DRM systems. That part of it is fine, and it is getting cheaper to do that over time. Any other questions?
Sorry, did you see in your experience cases where people using conditional access systems expanded them to DRM cases?
Absolutely, absolutely. Sometimes with the same vendor, sometimes with a different vendor. The CAS guys are getting better and better about having in-house DRM offerings. They tend to take two different approaches. So sometimes they help their existing customers pretend that the old world is the new world, and there's a need for that kind of medicine also. There are others who are just completely radically modernizing in lockstep with the most aggressive OTT competitors. And you have those types of offerings also. I don't think there's anything that says that a good CAS vendor can't be a good DRM vendor. They're getting better and better about having the kinds of partnerships or the in-house investments that they need. But certainly the economics of and the operational aspect of DRM is very, very different from the economics and operational aspects of CAS. Well, thank you very much for your time, everyone. I really appreciate it.